He was diving to the bottom of the ocean when he stumbled upon a strange, airtight container. What he saw inside made him turn pale. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a low swell that rolled slowly toward the Florida coast. The horizon was clean again, the kind of endless blue that could lull even the most experienced seaman into forgetting how unforgiving the water could be. On the deck of the Atlantic Surveyor, the air smelled of salt, rust, and diesel fumes, and a thin layer of mist clung to the railings as the morning sun began to lift. For most of the crew, it was just another day at sea. For Derek Miller, it was supposed to be another routine dive, another box to check on a list of underwater inspections that had long lost their thrill. Derek was a man who rarely spoke more than necessary, but his presence on the ship had weight. Years of diving had left his skin marked by the sun and salt, his hands coarse and scarred from constant contact with metal and rope. He moved deliberately, with the easy confidence of someone who had lived more hours underwater than most men spent driving cars. That morning, he went through the familiar ritual of preparation, checking his air mix, cleaning the seal on his mask, inspecting his dive knife, adjusting the straps of his fins, and verifying the readings on his depth gauge and pressure monitor. Around him, the rest of the crew were preparing the winches and tether lines. The assignment was simple enough. The company had been contracted by a communications consortium to inspect a section of undersea cable after last week's tropical storm. It was a stretch of seabed Derek knew well. Flat, silty, predictable. There was no reason to expect surprises, but experience had taught him that the ocean didn't care about reason. The ocean always kept something hidden. He stood by the rail, watching the sunlight flicker over the surface, and for a moment he let the steady rhythm of the waves fill the silence in his head. The sound of the compressor kicked on behind him, sharp and mechanical, breaking the calm. The dive supervisor gave him a nod. "You're good to go, Miller." Derek returned the nod and lowered himself into the water without a word. The first few feet were the same as always, the faint resistance of the surface giving way to cool, endless silence. Visibility was better than he'd expected. The storm had churned the upper layers, but down here the world was still and calm. The beam from his headlamp sliced through a field of suspended particles, revealing the faint shimmer of the cable line beneath him. He followed it carefully, hand over hand, inspecting for visible damage, taking short bursts of photographs with the mounted camera. A small crack in the insulation, minor abrasions, nothing unusual. He was almost ready to ascend when something caught his eye off to the right. At first, it was just a shape, a faint reflection of light that didn't fit the texture of the sand. He drifted closer, frowning behind his mask. The surface was smooth, unnaturally straight, a corner of something metallic half buried under silt and sea growth. The dimensions were too precise to be rock. It was man-made. He hovered for a moment, measuring the edges in his mind. It looked like the corner of a large box, maybe a shipping container, though there was no sign of the usual corrugation or painted markings. Curiosity overrode protocol. He turned on his wrist camera and began recording as he cleared the sediment with gentle sweeps of his gloved hand. The metal was pale and cold to the touch, slick but strangely unpitted. He expected to see corrosion, barnacles, or some kind of marine life clinging to the surface, but there was almost nothing. Just smooth, unblemished metal, as though the object had only recently been placed there. Derek leaned in closer. Along the edge, where the sand met steel, he could see the faint trace of a welded seam. The craftsmanship was deliberate, too deliberate for standard shipping equipment. He checked his depth gauge, just under 100 meters. The object shouldn't have been here. The nearest cargo routes ran far offshore, and no records of recent wrecks had crossed their briefings. For a moment, the water felt heavier around him, pressing closer. He marked the coordinates on his digital pad, took several stills, and studied the surroundings. The seabed was otherwise featureless, a monotonous plain of sand and broken shells. This object sat in eerie isolation, like it had been dropped from the sky. He stayed a few minutes longer, examining the corners and searching for serial numbers, but there were none. The surface was completely unmarked. No paint, no etched letters, nothing that could identify its origin. He tried to pry a small section of sediment near the base to look for a foundation, but the steel continued straight downward. It was embedded deep. Something about it unsettled him, though he couldn't explain why. He'd seen plenty of wreckage in his career, old hulls, fallen cranes, even plane fragments, but this was different. This felt intentional. He took one last photograph, then began his slow ascent. As he rose, the shape of the object receded into the murky blue until it was just a darker shadow against the sand. He kept his breathing steady, pausing at his decompression stop, watching the bubbles spiral upward past his visor. The ocean above shimmered with sunlight, but the thought of that silent metal box sitting on the seafloor lingered in his mind. When he broke the surface, the team was already leaning over the rail, waiting for the thumbs-up signal. Derek raised a hand, then climbed the ladder, his gear dripping onto the deck. The air felt hot after the chill of the deep. Someone handed him a towel. Another man took his tanks. "Find anything?" the supervisor asked casually. Derek hesitated before answering. "Something. Not part of the line." They crowded around the monitor as he uploaded the camera feed. The image flickered on the screen. Grainy, pale blue light, then the gleaming corner of the object. A murmur went through the group. One of the younger technicians whistled softly. "What the hell is that thing?" Nobody had an answer. The supervisor leaned closer, adjusting the zoom. "Could be a container," he said finally, "but it's not standard issue. Look at those seams." Derek dried his hands and watched the replay again. Silent. The light glinted off the metal just enough to show the texture. No corrosion, no barnacle clusters, as if it had been sealed against the water entirely. The more he looked, the less it resembled anything he'd seen on a ship. He uploaded the coordinates, labeled the file, and filled out his report, all by the book. But something in the back of his mind refused to let it go. Later, as the ship idled on the calm water and the sun drifted toward afternoon, Derek sat near the stern, reviewing the footage again on his tablet. The waves slapped against the hull in slow, rhythmic intervals, like the ticking of a clock. He zoomed in on one still frame, examining the faint weld lines. They weren't crude. Whoever built that container had intended it to survive pressure and time. He thought about the silence of the seafloor, how unnatural the thing had looked resting there. By the time the shift ended, he had written a full note to the supervisor recommending a retrieval operation. The object's placement and condition were too unusual to ignore, and the company could claim salvage rights if it turned out to have value. He sent the report before he could change his mind. That night, while most of the crew played cards in the mess hall, Derek stayed alone on deck. The ocean stretched around him in every direction, black and endless, the surface broken only by the faint reflection of the moon. He leaned on the railing, listening to the low hum of the engines and the faraway hiss of the waves. Somewhere beneath them, 100 meters down, that container sat untouched, sealed tight against time and salt. He imagined the pressure pressing against its sides, the cold stillness of the deep, the slow settling of sediment over years. But he couldn't shake the question that had taken root during the dive. Containers sink all the time. Storms, accidents, carelessness. Yet they always bear marks of their origin. Logos, numbers, dents, rust. This one had none. It was as if it had been placed there on purpose, hidden in plain sight. He looked up at the horizon again, where a faint line of light was beginning to appear, the early sign of another day. He told himself it was just a find like any other, nothing more than steel and mystery. But deep down, he knew it wasn't true. The ocean had many secrets, but this one felt close, deliberate, almost human. When dawn came, the Atlantic surveyor was already moving toward new coordinates, and Derek was back in his suit, ready to dive again. Yet, this time, as he adjusted his mask and prepared for descent, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Anticipation, edged with unease. The kind that comes when a diver senses that the next descent might change more than just the logbook. He exhaled slowly, cleared his mind, and let himself slide back into the water. The surface closed above his head, and the light faded to green. He followed the guide rope down, each meter pulling him farther from the noise of the world, closer to that silent shape waiting below. He didn't yet know that the discovery he'd made would ripple far beyond the coordinates he had marked, or that the still metal box beneath him held not treasure, not wreckage, but a truth that had been deliberately buried. For now, there was only the deep hum of the ocean, the pulse in his ears and the gleam of something impossible resting on the seabed where nothing should have been. And as his fins brushed the sand once more, Derek Miller felt that the routine dive he'd begun that morning had ended, in every sense, the life he'd known before. The morning after Derek's first encounter with the object, the Atlantic surveyor returned to the same coordinates under a sky streaked with pale orange. The air was cooler than the day before, but the mood on deck was charged with a quiet energy. Word had spread among the crew, and even those who normally cared little for the details of their assignments were drawn to the mystery of the container resting on the ocean floor. The ship's small galley buzzed with low conversation as people speculated about what it could be: a military crate, a sunken prototype, some government cache. Derek listened but said nothing. He sat apart with his coffee, reviewing the previous day's dive logs and the still images he had extracted overnight. The official plan that morning had changed. After Derek's report and the supervisor's brief call to the company's operations office, authorization had been given for a limited retrieval mission. It wasn't unusual to lift debris for inspection, but this was different. The object's weight, the lack of corrosion, and its location in otherwise barren seabed made it an anomaly worth recovering. The office wanted it topside. The chain of command had spoken, and the crew prepared without question, though everyone felt the undertone of unease. By 8 o'clock, the crane operator, riggers, and divers were assembled on deck, working with the smooth precision of men who had done this countless times before. Derek moved among them, checking the harnesses, inspecting the strops, and examining the compressed air hoses for leaks. The smell of lubricant and sea spray mingled in the air. The plan was simple enough in theory. He would descend first with 2 additional divers, assess the surrounding sediment, and attach the lifting slings to the most secure corners. Once the container was safely harnessed, the crane would begin a slow lift to avoid pressure shock and suction resistance from the seabed. The crew lowered the ROV first, a remotely operated camera drone, to take a fresh look at the target before anyone entered the water. The video feed appeared on the main monitor inside the control cabin. The image came into focus through a shimmer of blue haze. There it was again. The same unmarked block of metal, half buried, the same clean edges, the same unnatural geometry. Even after a night of analysis, Derek still felt a flicker of disbelief that something so pristine could have rested so long in salt water. The ROV circled slowly, capturing the object from multiple angles. The supervisor noted dimensions, depth, estimated mass. "Looks like 12 feet long, maybe 8 high," he murmured. "If that's steel, we're talking several tons." Derek stepped closer to the screen, studying the details. The light from the ROV lamps glided along the surface like oil over glass, reflecting back in smooth gradients. No sign of rust, no pitting, no paint blisters, nothing that even suggested it had been exposed to water for more than a few days. It didn't make sense. Steel, even the best marine grade, begins to scar almost immediately in seawater. Yet this surface looked untouched. He glanced at the supervisor, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. They both knew it was odd, and neither wanted to voice what they were thinking, that something about this object defied normal explanation, though not in any supernatural way. It was simply too well built, too intentional. When it was time to dive, Derek was the first to go. The water closed over his head with a cool hiss, and the faint hum of the ship faded into the liquid stillness of the deep. He followed the descent line slowly, his flashlight cutting through the dimness. The water was calm now, the turbulence from the storm gone. Schools of small fish drifted past him, indifferent to his presence. As he neared the sea floor, the shadow of the container loomed below, just as he had left it. He hovered a few feet above the sand, letting the silt settle before approaching. The object looked even larger up close, its edges too perfect against the irregular texture of the seabed. The other 2 divers arrived moments later, their lights converging in narrow beams. They moved methodically, clearing sediment from the corners while Derek documented everything on camera. The strops were fixed carefully around the base, 2 on each side, forming a cross pattern that would distribute weight evenly. Every move was slow, deliberate. One mistake could shift the balance of the lift and send tons of metal swinging uncontrollably. Derek adjusted the tension manually, feeling for resistance through the cable. When everything was secure, he signaled the surface team. The first pull came gently, a low creak that vibrated through the water. The container resisted, clinging to the mud as if unwilling to let go. The divers backed away to a safe distance as the crane increased power. The seabed trembled, and a cloud of silt erupted in a pale bloom. Inch by inch, the container began to rise. Derek watched it lift from the sand, revealing its underside for the first time. It was perfectly flat, with no anchors, no structural damage, no sign of age. As it ascended, a faint tremor ran through the cable, and the ship above shifted slightly, compensating for the strain. Through the comm line, Derek heard the faint voice of the supervisor. "She's heavier than we calculated. Stand clear." The sound of the winch groaned faintly in his earpiece, mechanical and strained. Derek followed the object's upward movement until it disappeared into the fading light above. He took one last sweep of the sea floor, confirming there was nothing else in the vicinity, then began his ascent. The decompression stops felt longer than usual, though he couldn't tell if it was the pressure or the weight of curiosity pressing on him. When he surfaced, the deck was already alive with motion. The crane's engine roared, and the winch cable trembled under load, Crewmen shouted over the wind as the dark outline of the container broke the surface, water streaming off it in sheets. The ship tilted briefly, then steadied as the crane swung the massive box inward. With a metallic thud, it landed on the deck, shaking the floor beneath their boots. For a moment, no one moved. Everyone just stared. It looked even stranger out of the water. The color of the metal wasn't the dull gray they expected, but a muted silver, almost luminous under sunlight. The sides were seamless, each edge meeting at a precise right angle, and the surface felt cold to the touch. A few of the crew crouched near the base, running their hands along it. "It's bone dry," one of them said quietly, almost disbelieving. Derek knelt beside him and confirmed it. No water leaked from anywhere, no moisture beaded on the seams. A normal container should have been filled with seawater, its contents soaked and swollen, but this one was sealed tight, like a vacuum chamber. The supervisor ordered everyone back as he inspected the top. There was a single locking mechanism, heavy, industrial, rust-free. No padlocks, just a reinforced handle recessed into the surface. He gave it a tug. It didn't move. "We'll need cutters," he muttered. Derek watched in silence, hands on his knees, his mind turning over possibilities. The construction was too precise for an accident. Someone had wanted this sealed, and they had done it well. Hours passed as they cleaned the surface, measured the dimensions, and logged the find officially. The company's protocol required every discovery to be documented before any attempt to open it. The supervisor sent a brief message to headquarters describing the condition of the object and its unusual resistance to corrosion. Within minutes, the reply came back. "Maintain possession. Prepare for preliminary opening under controlled conditions." By late afternoon, the container sat near the stern, chained to the deck for stability. The crew had returned to their routines, though no woman could ignore its silent presence. Even the sound of the waves against the hull seemed different, muted, as if the air around the container absorbed the noise. Derek sat nearby, writing in his logbook, recording details he knew might matter later: depth, temperature, lift tension, duration of exposure. But his thoughts drifted beyond numbers. He found himself wondering not just what the box contained, but who had gone to such lengths to keep it sealed, and for how long. As the sun dipped towards the horizon, the metal reflected the last light like glass. Derek leaned against the railing, staring at it. He'd recovered dozens of objects over the years: wreckage, lost equipment, old shipping containers half-eaten by rust, but never something like this. The lack of corrosion was almost unsettling. He imagined it resting on the seabed for years, undisturbed, untouched by time, waiting for someone curious enough to bring it back. Now that someone was him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had disturbed something meant to stay hidden. That night, the ship anchored offshore. The sea was calm, the sky clear, stars scattered like shards of glass. The crew's laughter echoed faintly from the galley, but Derek stayed outside, pacing the deck. The container stood motionless under the deck lights, its edges sharp against the shadows. He noticed condensation forming on the railing and equipment nearby, but the surface of the container remained dry and untouched. Even the salt in the air seemed to slide off it. He reached out and touched the metal again. It was cold, unnaturally cold, as if it retained the temperature of the deep. The supervisor approached quietly, carrying a clipboard. "We'll open it tomorrow," he said, not looking at Derek. "Head office wants full footage and 2 engineers present." Derek nodded. He knew they wouldn't wait long. Something like this would draw attention from more than just company management. Salvage rights, insurance claims, maritime law, everyone would want a piece. When the supervisor walked away, Derek stayed a while longer, watching the light glint along the welds. The lines were too perfect to be random. Whoever built this had meant it to last through pressure, corrosion, and time itself. He found himself wondering if the ocean had been protecting it or concealing it. He didn't yet know that by lifting it out of the deep, he had begun to unravel a story buried for decades, a story no one had wanted to surface. He went to bed late, the gentle rocking of the ship lulling him into a shallow sleep filled with flashes of blue light and the sound of metal scraping against sand. When morning came, he woke before dawn and stepped back onto the deck. The sky was the color of steel, and the container loomed where they had left it, unchanging, unyielding, waiting. In that quiet hour before the crew awoke, Derek felt something like foreboding, a diver's instinct that what they were about to open was not just another piece of scrap pulled from the sea. It was a vault of silence, and once breached it would not easily close again. He poured himself another cup of coffee, the wind carrying the smell of salt through the air, and looked at the faint line of light spreading across the horizon. The day had come to find out what kind of metal could defy the ocean, and what kind of secret was worth such careful concealment. By sunrise, the Atlantic surveyor was already stirring. The engines idled softly, the deck wet with dew, and the air smelled faintly of iron and fuel. The crew moved with subdued urgency, their eyes inevitably drawn to the massive container resting near the stern, its metallic surface catching the first rays of daylight. The decision had been made. They would open it that morning, and the company's remote representatives would monitor every step through the live video. It was standard procedure for high-value recoveries, but everyone aboard felt the gravity of this one. They all knew that what lay inside could redefine the nature of their find, possibly even their careers. Derek had barely slept. He had woken long before dawn, restless, feeling the vibration of the ship beneath him like a pulse. As he sipped his coffee, he watched the horizon lighten through the porthole. His mind replayed every moment of the dive, the image of the container lying silent on the seabed. Now it sat exposed to the open air, as if ripped from its natural resting place. He couldn't shake the thought that maybe it wasn't meant to be moved at all. On deck, the supervisor, Captain Holt, and the operations engineer Ramirez were reviewing the checklist. Safety perimeter set, recording devices operational, emergency extinguishers and sealant foam at hand in case of pressurization. It wasn't often that a simple metal box generated such careful preparation. Yet no one could predict what was inside. There were no markings to identify hazardous material, but its unusual preservation had everyone on edge. Derek joined them silently, glancing at the cold surface of the container. The welds were still immaculate, the edges clean and sharp. Overnight, moisture had condensed on every piece of steel around it except the box itself. It remained bone dry, as if rejecting the environment. Holt noticed Derek's stare. "Hard to believe this thing spent years under the sea," he muttered. Derek said nothing. The captain sighed, adjusted his gloves, and gave the order to begin. Two of the deckhands rolled over the hydraulic cutter, the kind designed to breach submarine hatches and thick pipes. They secured it to the locking mechanism, and the sharp whine of metal against metal filled the air. The crew stood back, eyes squinting against the sparks. The smell of heated steel cut through the salty breeze. Slowly, the cutter bit through the lock, sending tiny orange embers scattering across the deck. When the sound stopped, a silence followed that was almost physical, heavy and expectant. Holt stepped forward, took a wrench from his belt, and nudged the handle. Nothing happened. He frowned, put his full weight into it, and tried again. This time the handle moved a fraction, then stopped. Derek stepped closer, holding out his hand. "Let me," he said quietly. The captain hesitated, then nodded. Derek grasped the cold metal with both hands and pulled. It resisted, then suddenly gave way with a deep metallic groan that echoed across the ship. The sound was like a sigh from something ancient, disturbed after too long a sleep. The seal broke, releasing a faint hiss, not of gas or vapor, just the sound of air meeting air after decades of separation. The hinges creaked as Holt and Ramirez pulled the doors open together. Everyone leaned forward instinctively, expecting the smell of decay, oil, or salt, but none came. The air that escaped was dry and odorless, unnervingly clean. Inside, under the harsh light of the deck lamps, was not the mechanical interior they had imagined, nor the remains of a wrecked cargo. What they saw was something altogether different. The interior of the container had been transformed into a room. A small, self-contained living space, complete with a narrow bed bolted to the floor, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bookshelf, and what looked like a kitchenette along one wall. Everything was secured in place with bolts and clamps, as though designed to withstand movement. Even the cups on the table were fixed with adhesive mounts. The surfaces were dusty, but intact. For a long moment, no one spoke. The image was too strange to process. A room sealed inside a container, perfectly preserved at the bottom of the ocean. The light from above fell across the furniture, the faded color of the sheets, the outlines of books stacked neatly on the shelf. It was an image both domestic and haunting, a frozen echo of someone's life. Ramirez finally broke the silence, speaking softly. What the hell were they doing down there? He stepped inside cautiously, his boots clanking on the metal floor. Derek followed, his eyes scanning every detail. The space was eerily tidy, as if its inhabitant had stepped out just moments ago. The table was still set with a ceramic mug, a small notebook beside it, and a pen lying diagonally across the page. He ran a gloved hand over the table's surface, leaving a clean streak through a thin layer of dust. The air inside felt strangely dry, more like that of a sealed laboratory than a sunken wreck. He looked towards the far wall where a small closet door was slightly ajar. Inside hung a single jacket, the kind issued to construction workers decades earlier, faded orange with reflective strips. On the collar was a stitched logo, barely legible under the grime, Harris and Wold Construction. Derek froze. He had seen that name the day before, on the documents and equipment stowed near the base of the container when they first opened it. The same company whose name had become infamous 20 years ago when a bridge collapse had killed dozens. The disaster had bankrupted them and disappeared from public memory soon after. What remained was rumor, corruption, missing funds, and falsified reports. He stepped back, his pulse rising. The idea that this container could somehow be connected felt unreal, yet undeniable. Captain Holt stood at the threshold, his face tense. "Photograph everything. Don't touch a thing until we log it." Derek nodded automatically, though his mind was elsewhere. Whoever had lived in this container had done so deliberately. The bed, the tools, even the small reading lamp wired into an improvised battery pack suggested someone had spent time here, maybe months. And yet, it had all been sealed tight, waterproofed to perfection, and sunk deep enough that no diver would stumble upon it by chance. One of the younger crew members, Ellis, bent down near the foot of the bed. "There's something under here," he said, reaching carefully. He pulled out a stack of papers protected by a thin plastic sleeve. Inside were black and white photographs, construction sites, blueprints, men in hard hats standing before concrete pillars. Some of the images bore the same logo. Others were marked with red pen, circles drawn around certain structural joints. Beneath the photos was a weathered ledger filled with handwritten notes. Derek flipped through it carefully. The handwriting was small and precise, every page dated and signed with the same initials, AO. The initials matched a signature on one of the official company documents they had found the previous day, Ahmed Osman, Senior Structural Engineer. Derek remembered the name now. It had been mentioned briefly in one of the case summaries surrounding the bridge collapse. Osman had vanished during the investigation, presumed drowned after his car was found near a flooded quarry. No one had ever found his body. As realization dawned, Derek looked around the container again, his thoughts racing. The living quarters, the careful sealing, the hidden records, it all pointed to one conclusion. Osman hadn't died. He had hidden himself and his evidence beneath the sea. "Captain," Derek said quietly, "you should see this." Holt approached, his jaw tightening as he scanned the photos. "Get this logged and secure," he ordered, but his voice had lost some of its command. "We'll let headquarters decide what to do with it." They spent the next hours cataloging every item. The process was meticulous. Photographs, serial numbers, temperature readings, humidity checks. Derek noted how each piece of furniture was either bolted or glued, how the walls had been reinforced from the inside with insulation panels. The container wasn't just waterproof, it was engineered as a self-contained vault. He found faint marks along the edges where caulking had sealed every seam. Even the small air vent had been welded shut. Whoever designed this knew how to build against pressure, moisture, and time. When the official inspection ended, Holt dismissed the non-essential crew and ordered the area cordoned off. Derek remained behind, unable to leave. He crouched near the table, staring at the notebook left open. The ink had not faded completely, though it was hard to read. He turned the page slowly. There were sketches, beam diagrams, angle measurements, lines of text written in terse technical shorthand. At the bottom of one page was a sentence in larger, uneven letters, as if written in haste. They knew it would fail. They wanted it hidden. He felt a chill. The words spoke of guilt and fear, the kind that drives a man to disappear. It also explained the container's impossible preservation. Osman had built it to outlast the elements, to keep his evidence safe until someone found it. Derek realized that by pulling it up, they had resurrected not just a man's secret, but a scandal buried decades deep. As dusk fell, the crew finished sealing the doors with temporary straps. Holt wanted the container transferred to port under watch before opening any compartments further. The company would send specialist lawyers and investigators. It was out of their hands now, but Derek knew this was only the beginning. Something about the whole operation felt off. The urgency from headquarters, the lack of communication, the uneasy silence from everyone involved. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was less a discovery than a disturbance, and that forces far beyond their ship already knew about it. That night, long after the deck had emptied, Derek stood alone beside the sealed container. The moonlight reflected softly off its smooth surface. He thought of the man who might have lived inside it, perhaps in fear, perhaps out of conscience. He imagined him sitting at that table, writing in his notebook as the world above forgot him, a man who had built his own tomb to keep the truth alive. The sea was calm again, indifferent to their find. In the stillness, Derek felt both awe and unease. The deep had given up one of its secrets, but the cost of that revelation, whatever it might be, had yet to surface. He took one last look at the steel box, its silent walls hiding a lifetime of desperation and resolve, and then turned away. Somewhere in the dark, the ocean shifted quietly against the hull, as if reminding him that the past never stays buried for long. The Atlantic Surveyor drifted quietly in the calm morning waters, its engines humming at idle as the crew went about their work with a strange, muted efficiency. The excitement from the previous day had settled into a heavy, watchful silence. The container, now strapped and sealed under tarp, dominated the stern like a slumbering animal, motionless but radiating unease. No one dared to go near it without orders. It was as if the discovery of the furnished interior, the documents, and the faded photographs had infected the ship with a quiet dread. Something about what they had found inside that steel box had made the ocean feel suddenly less vast and more claustrophobic, as though the truth beneath the surface could drown them just as easily as water. Derek woke to the sound of low voices outside his cabin. He lay still for a moment, listening. He recognized Captain Holt's deep, measured tone and another voice, smooth, formal, and unfamiliar. It was only when the footsteps moved past his door and up the narrow metal stairs that he exhaled and sat up. He rubbed his eyes, then looked at the clock. It was barely 7, but there was already activity on deck. Through the small porthole he could see a larger vessel approaching from the horizon, its hull white, its movements deliberate. It wasn't a Coast Guard cutter or a research ship. The silhouette was sleeker, more corporate. By the time Derek climbed onto deck, 3 men in dark waterproof jackets were stepping aboard, their polished shoes at odds with the scuffed, salt-worn planks. Their clothes bore the logo of Maritech Holdings, the parent company that contracted their dives. Derek recognized the name instantly. It was a name that carried money, influence, and lawyers. The man leading them was tall, mid-50s, silver hair perfectly combed back, his face expressionless behind sunglasses. He shook Holt's hand with the sort of polite firmness that spoke more of ownership than greeting. Behind him, 2 assistants carried clipboards and a small hard case, the kind used for secure drives or documents. The crew gathered at a distance, whispering among themselves. The sudden arrival of executives out at sea was anything but normal. Derek hung back, watching. Holt gestured for the men to follow him toward the stern, where the tarp-covered container sat chained to the deck. One of the visitors knelt, lifting the edge of the tarp, examining the seal. The lead man spoke quietly to Holt, who responded with short, restrained sentences. Whatever was being discussed, it was clear the tone was more command than consultation. After a few minutes, Holt turned and motioned for Derek to come over. His expression gave away nothing. Derek approached, feeling the weight of the executive's eyes on him. "Mr. Miller," Holt said evenly, "these gentlemen are here from head office. They've been briefed on our recovery. They'll be taking custody of the container and all related documentation." Derek nodded but stayed silent. The silver-haired man extended a hand, smiling with professional detachment. "Mr. Miller, I'm Alan Graves, Operations Director for Maritech. We've reviewed your dive logs. Excellent work. Your discovery is of considerable historical value." His voice was smooth, almost too smooth. "Our company intends to ensure the material is handled appropriately in coordination with state authorities." Derek shook his hand, his grip firm, but he felt the subtext immediately. There was no gratitude in Graves's tone, only control. Graves's eyes flicked to the chain securing the container. "Captain Holt, please have this transferred to our vessel within the hour. We'll oversee transport to the mainland." Holt hesitated. "Sir, our standard salvage protocol requires documentation of transfer. We haven't completed the interior cataloging. My diver has notes that haven't been logged officially." Graves removed his sunglasses, revealing pale gray eyes. "Captain, we'll handle all paperwork at our facility. Your team has already exceeded the scope of your contract." His voice dropped slightly. "We appreciate your discretion." The message was clear. Derek felt something tighten in his chest. Discretion meant silence. And once that container left their ship, whatever was inside, Osmond's records, the evidence of corruption, the traces of a man who had vanished, would vanish again. For the next hour, the crew obeyed the orders reluctantly. The crane lifted the container slowly, the steel chains creaking as it swung through the air toward the waiting vessel. Derek stood near the railing, watching the operation in grim silence. The executive's ship loomed close, and its deck empty except for a few uniformed staff in sterile gloves. No company markings beyond the logo, just blank hull, polished railings, and efficiency. As the container settled onto their platform, Derek noticed one of Graves's assistants attach a small electronic tag to its corner, scanning it with a device. Not for inventory, Derek realized, but for tracking. They were marking evidence as property. When the last cable was unhooked and the container secured, Graves offered a final handshake to Holt. "You and your team will receive an adjusted bonus for your contribution. Please forward your full report to our legal office. From this point on, all communications regarding the recovery are confidential." Holt nodded stiffly, his jaw tight. Graves and his team boarded their vessel and were gone within minutes, the sound of engines fading into the horizon. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Ellis, the youngest deckhand, muttered what everyone was thinking. "They're gonna bury it again, aren't they?" Holt shot him a sharp look but didn't deny it. He dismissed the crew for the day and went below deck, leaving Derek alone by the railing. The rest of the afternoon passed in uneasy quiet. Derek went through the motions, checking the ROV cables, updating the dive logs, but his thoughts kept circling back to the container and the way the company men had moved. Too smooth, too rehearsed. He had seen plenty of corporate recoveries before, but this one had been more like a confiscation. They hadn't even asked about the contents, the photographs, or the notebook. They already knew. Later that evening, Derek found himself in the storage cabin, reviewing the duplicate photos he had saved on his personal drive. He had copied them quietly before the company representatives arrived. He stared at the images on his tablet, the blueprints, the construction notes, the sketches marked in red. They were the kind of documents that could ruin reputations, maybe even reopen investigations long closed. He zoomed in on one photo, a structural cross-section of the bridge, annotated in a hurried scrawl. There were numbers altered, signatures scratched out and rewritten, a cover-up hidden in plain sight. He heard footsteps in the corridor and quickly powered down the screen. Captain Holt entered, closing the door behind him. He looked tired, older than he had the day before. "I know what you're thinking," he said quietly, "but you need to let this go. What you saw, what we found, it's not ours anymore." Derek didn't answer. Holt sighed. They paid for the mission. The rights belonged to them. You start talking and they'll bury you right alongside that container, you understand?" His voice softened. "You did good work, Derek. Don't throw it away." When the captain left, Derek sat in silence. Outside, the sea was black and still, the moonlight glimmering off its surface. He thought about Osman, the man who had hidden himself and his evidence so completely that it had taken 2 decades and a storm to bring him back to light. The company had taken that truth again, sealed it away, but Derek had seen too much to pretend it didn't matter. The following day, the Atlantic Surveyor docked at a small port for refueling and resupply. The crew dispersed ashore for a few hours of rest, but Derek stayed behind. He knew what he had to do. From the privacy of his cabin, he transferred copies of the files to a secure folder, then composed a brief anonymous message to a journalist he trusted, someone who had once covered the bridge collapse and written about the unanswered questions surrounding it. The email was simple. Recovered material related to Harris and Wold collapse. Evidence attached. Confirm authenticity before publishing. He hit send and sat back, heart pounding. By the time the crew returned, the message had been delivered. He deleted all traces of it from his device, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the company realized what he had done. Still, the decision felt right. The container might be gone, but its contents would not vanish quietly this time. That night, the wind picked up. Waves slapped against the hull, and the ship rocked gently in the dark. Derek stood on deck, staring at the empty space where the container had been. The sea stretched endlessly, indifferent to human secrets. Somewhere out there, under the watchful eyes of corporate men, that steel box was being locked away again, hidden under layers of bureaucracy and silence. But now the truth inside it was no longer theirs alone. He turned towards the lights of the port, distant and golden against the black water. The decision he had made would change everything. His job, his reputation, maybe even his safety. But he felt no regret. The sea had given him a gift, and he had passed it forward. What came next was beyond his control. As he leaned against the railing, the wind whipping across his face, Derek thought of Osman's final words written in that notebook. They knew it would fail. They wanted it hidden. He understood now what those words really meant. Some truths are too heavy to float, and the people who fear them will always try to sink them deeper. But no matter how far down they fall, the ocean never forgets. It just waits for someone willing to dive deep enough to find them again. And as the ship prepared to depart for its next assignment, Derek knew that, for better or worse, he had already taken that plunge. The sun was already climbing above the horizon when the Atlantic Surveyor left port and resumed its course along the southern coast. The sea stretched calm and featureless ahead, the kind of gentle glassy surface that belied the deeper tensions below. For most of the crew, the departure was just another turn in their contract, another series of dives, coordinates, and seabed measurements. But for Derek Miller, everything had changed. The message he had sent 2 days prior still haunted him, not because he doubted it, but because it meant stepping beyond the protective confines of protocol. He had done what he believed was right, passing on the evidence to someone who might have the reach and courage to expose it. But now, every knock at his cabin door, every whispered conversation on deck, felt loaded with implication. He kept his composure. On the outside, he was still the same diver, still methodical, still quiet, still one of the few who didn't flinch when the ocean called. But inside, he felt the weight of what he had seen in that container and the cold precision with which it had been reclaimed by corporate hands. His instincts told him the story wasn't over, that the container's removal was just the beginning of something larger, more calculated. By mid-morning, the tension became tangible. It arrived not in confrontation, but in bureaucracy. Holt summoned Derek to the communications room, where a secure satellite call had been routed through to the ship. The air inside was stale, heavy with the faint hum of electronics. On the small monitor, a face flickered into view, one of Maritech's legal officers, a man named Ronald Keller, whose reputation was well known among company crews. He wasn't a lawyer in the courtroom sense, but a fixer, a man who handled internal issues with a mixture of charm and veiled threat. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice smooth and clipped, "thank you for joining us. I've reviewed the incident report regarding the container recovery. First, let me commend you for your professionalism and quick thinking during the operation. It reflects well on the entire surveyor crew." Derek nodded once, but said nothing. "There's just one small matter," Keller continued, his tone tightening slightly. "Our records show a discrepancy in the transfer of photographic files. According to the equipment logs, an external storage device was connected to the primary camera rig during offload. That device is not listed in the manifest." Derek felt a slow burn begin at the back of his neck. He kept his expression still. "I'm sure it was an oversight," Keller added, a pause lingering between words, "but we'll need confirmation that all data from the dive, including personal backups, has been returned to Maritech. This is standard procedure for classified recovery operations, of course." Classified. The word hung in the air like fog. "I've submitted everything I was required to submit," Derek said finally, his voice even. Keller gave a small smile. "Excellent. Then I trust there won't be any confusion going forward. As I'm sure you understand, Maritech takes data security very seriously. Unauthorized retention of sensitive material could be misinterpreted as a breach of contract, or worse." The threat was plain now, dressed in polite language but sharp as a blade. Derek offered no response. Keller's face remained frozen for a moment, then flickered off the screen. The call ended. Captain Holt, who had stood silently by the door throughout, turned toward Derek with a look that was more resigned than accusatory. "They're watching everything now," he said. "Not just you. All of us." Derek left the communications room with a growing sense of unease. He had expected some pushback, but this was more than caution. It was pressure. He knew the company's tactics. Maritech didn't need to threaten jobs directly. They just changed assignments, froze promotions, reassigned people to less desirable operations. They made careers vanish with a pen stroke. By early afternoon, he noticed changes. His name had been removed from the primary dive schedule. His login credentials for the archival terminal were revoked. Even small things, access to the ROV control cabin, the inventory system, were stripped without explanation. When he asked one of the engineers, she shrugged uncomfortably. "They told us you're under review. I don't know more." It didn't take long for rumors to start. Whispers followed him through the narrow halls of the ship, not hostile, but cautious. He became a shadow among his own crew. Holt did nothing to intervene, and Derek didn't expect him to. The captain was doing what he had always done, preserving the ship, minimizing risk, avoiding the storm. Still, Derek refused to fold. He began documenting everything: the dates of revoked access, the emails he wasn't copied on, the changes to the project structure. He kept a quiet, private log, not as leverage, but as insurance. He didn't trust that things would stay quiet forever. 2 days later, he received a message that nearly made his heart stop. It came not from Maritech, but from the journalist. The email was brief. Files received. Preliminary review confirms authenticity. This is big. Let's talk. Securely. Derek read it 3 times. The confirmation meant that the evidence hadn't been dismissed, that it hadn't vanished into the void like he had feared, but it also meant time was running out. Once the company learned that the documents had reached outside hands, their response would escalate. That evening, the weather turned. A low-pressure system moved in from the east, bringing with it a curtain of mist and rolling fog. The sea darkened, and the crew began securing loose equipment on deck. The next series of dives were postponed, giving Derek an unusual pocket of time. He used it to draft a more detailed summary of what they had found: the interior layout of the container, the preserved documents, the connection to Harris and Wold. He included his own observations about the construction methods, how the container had been reinforced, how the furnishings were fixed in place, how the atmosphere inside had remained dry. He encrypted the file, stored it on a disposable USB, and placed it in a waterproof case. Then he hid it in the ballast compartment beneath his bunk. It was an old diver's habit. Always have a backup, even if you hope never to use it. The next morning, Holt summoned him again. This time, the conversation happened in the privacy of the captain's quarters. Holt looked drawn, more like a man trapped in a machine than one commanding it. "I got a call from someone higher than Keller," he said, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "They want me to start an internal review, formally, of you." Derek sipped the bitter drink without comment. "You'll stay on the ship, but no dives, no systems access. You're a liability now, Derek." "Because I asked questions," Derek said. Holt met his gaze. "Because you broke their chain of custody." The words landed with finality. Chain of custody, the sacred concept in corporate evidence management. Once broken, the integrity of the whole operation became suspect. Derek had disrupted that chain, and now he was being cut loose, not with accusation, but with quiet isolation. Back in his cabin, he felt the walls closing in. Not from guilt, but from the sheer weight of the system around him. The corporation had built its defenses not with guards or guns, but with procedures, contracts, and silence. It was like being smothered with a pillow. You could struggle, but there was no air and no one could hear you. He spent the next few days adrift on the ship's schedule. He still ate with the crew, still performed basic equipment checks, but the atmosphere had changed. Some of the younger men nodded to him with quiet respect, but others avoided his eyes. He had become a symbol of something unspoken, a man who had looked too closely and now carried the stain of suspicion. But not all signs pointed to defeat. Late one night, as the ship passed through a corridor of fog so thick it swallowed the stars, a small envelope appeared under his cabin door. Inside was a folded sheet of paper with a handwritten note. "Saw your backup photos before they wiped the shared drive. Keep fighting. Not everyone's bought." No signature, no handwriting he recognized, but it was enough. A reminder that even within the machine, cracks could form. The sea rolled on. The ship continued its path. Above them, the company maintained its pressure, trying to tighten control. But Derek had already broken free in the only way that mattered. He had let the truth surface. He knew they would try to bury it again, but this time he wasn't the only one watching, and if they wanted to stop him, they'd have to do more than revoke access or send legal threats. They'd have to come down to the depths where he had been. They wouldn't like what they found there. The sea had begun to shift again, a slow but perceptible change in rhythm that mirrored the undercurrents moving just beneath the surface of the world Derek had re-entered. While the Atlantic surveyor continued along its planned path, collecting sonar data and performing shallow inspections, the atmosphere on board had grown stagnant and watchful. Derek had been formally sidelined, his access curtailed, his role reduced to little more than a passenger, but the real developments were no longer happening within the steel corridors of the ship. They were happening far beyond the horizon, in newsrooms, inboxes, and quiet conversations that could no longer be controlled. It began not with a headline, but with a question. The journalist Derek had contacted, a woman named Mara Wilkes, published a carefully worded article in a respected investigative outlet, not naming Derek directly, but outlining the discovery of a sealed underwater container recovered during a licensed private marine operation. The article made no allegations. It didn't accuse or speculate. Instead, it presented facts. Blueprints showing inconsistencies in structural calculations for the Westbridge crossing, handwritten notes that contradicted the final reports submitted to the state, an archival photo of Ahmed Osman with the Harris and Wold logo on his safety vest. The final line of the piece read, "If this is a hoax, it is a sophisticated one. But if it is real, someone wanted this evidence lost forever." Within hours, it spread. Syndicated through affiliate networks, picked up by local news channels and national wire services. Online forums erupted in debate, some users digging up old public records, others re-examining the bridge collapse that had long been filed away as a closed case. The public had not forgotten the disaster, only moved on from it. But now, a door had opened again. Derek first read the article on a tablet borrowed from one of the younger crewmen who still acknowledged him with cautious loyalty. He sat in the empty galley, the quiet hum of refrigeration units and the distant drone of the ship's engines all but drowned beneath the noise building in his head. She had done it. She had verified the documents, run them through expert analysis, even consulted retired engineers to confirm their technical relevance. She hadn't named him, but he recognized his own phrasing in parts of the summary, and she hadn't sensationalized anything. The tone was sober, careful, designed to withstand legal fire. He looked out through the small porthole across the dark expanse of water. He had known the moment would come, but the reality of it still took his breath. It wasn't relief exactly. It was a release, like pressure equalizing after too long underwater. Something inside him settled and something else came alive, a sense of responsibility larger than his fear. That same day, Maritech responded. The company issued a press release denying any knowledge of the container's origins. They claimed the salvage operation had recovered industrial scrap with possible historical materials, and that they were cooperating with authorities. They labeled the leaked blueprints unauthenticated and suggested that the photographs may have been manipulated or removed from context, but the tone lacked confidence. It read like damage control drafted in a panic. That evening, Derek was summoned once again to the captain's quarters. Holt looked exhausted, a man trying to steer a ship with a broken compass. He didn't scold or interrogate. He simply handed Derek a printed email marked confidential. It was from the state attorney's office, a formal request for a statement, not an accusation, not yet, just an invitation to speak about the recovery, the condition of the materials, and any observations Derek might have made. Holt said nothing as Derek read it. The unspoken truth hung between them. The tides were shifting, and they were now under the jurisdiction of something far bigger than Maritech. In the following days, the company scrambled to contain the fallout. Internal memos were leaked. A former subcontractor came forward anonymously to verify elements of the recovered notes. An engineering professor published a breakdown showing how the discrepancies in the recovered blueprints aligned with the section of the bridge that had failed first. The story began to take on momentum. It moved beyond scandal. It moved toward accountability. Derek found himself at the center of a storm he could neither control nor retreat from. He received encrypted messages from journalists, cautious inquiries from former investigators, even quiet expressions of gratitude from families affected by the bridge collapse. Each message reminded him that the truth he had unearthed wasn't just technical. It was human. People had died. Families had lost parents, siblings, children, and all the while, the records had been hidden beneath the sea, entombed in steel and silence. A week after the article went viral, the authorities intervened. A federal investigative unit, operating in coordination with maritime law enforcement, issued a preservation order for all related materials. Maritech's facility, where the container had been stored, was visited by agents. Forensic specialists began cataloging the contents in controlled conditions. The integrity of the container was verified. The humidity levels matched what Derek had observed. The welds were consistent with ocean-proof sealing. The materials inside were dated, authenticated, and, crucially, unaltered. What followed was a media frenzy. Interviews with retired Harris and Wold engineers, debates on television panels, families of the deceased finally stepping in front of cameras to tell their stories again, this time with renewed hope that someone would be held responsible. And then came the indictments. 2 former executives, one still employed in a different construction firm, were arrested. Charges of negligent homicide, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to commit fraud were filed. Maritech was named in a civil lawsuit, accused of attempting to suppress evidence that implicated its past acquisitions. The name Ahmed Osman became central to the case. The man who had disappeared without a trace was now a posthumous whistleblower, his notebook read aloud in hearings, his annotations held up as key insights into the corner cutting that had doomed the bridge. The photos recovered from the container showed him younger, intense, standing beside blueprints he must have known were doctored. Some called him paranoid. Others called him a hero. Either way, his voice had finally been heard. Derek was called to testify, not in a courtroom, but in a deposition overseen by investigators. He described the container's discovery, the condition of the items, and the chain of events that followed. He was careful, factual, and restrained. He didn't need to embellish. The truth was strong enough. In the months that followed, Derek's world began to tilt back toward normal, though it never quite returned to what it had been. He was cleared of any wrongdoing. In fact, he was quietly commended by some within the legal system for preserving the data when others might have folded. But Maritech made no such gesture. His contract was allowed to expire. Offers to renew never came. His name was quietly blacklisted from projects where the company held influence. Still, something else had taken root. He began receiving messages from independent researchers, from marine archivists, even from small salvage crews looking for consultation. He had, without meaning to, become a symbol, not of rebellion, but of precision. A man who had stuck to protocol even when the ground beneath it gave way. The container itself was preserved, declared evidence, and eventually scheduled for exhibition in a maritime museum partnered with a civil engineering association. Not as a relic of mystery, but as a reminder of what silence can bury and what diligence can recover. The recreation of Osmond's sealed living space was reconstructed precisely, down to the bolt pattern on the bed frame and the alignment of the table lamp. Derek was invited to the opening ceremony. He declined quietly, but he sent a letter to be read aloud. In it, he wrote only a few lines. Truth is not neutral. It drifts like the ocean, always moving, always trying to surface. What we bury does not disappear. Sometimes it waits, and when it rises, it's up to us to recognize it, even when doing so costs us comfort, security, or peace. We don't dive for glory. We dive because something waits below. In the end, the story didn't belong to him. It belonged to Osmond, to the families, to the divers who might one day find something else sealed in metal at the bottom of the sea. But Derek carried it with him, as divers carry pressure long after resurfacing. The weight of it became part of him, not a burden, but a ballast. The Atlantic Surveyor completed its rotation and docked for overhaul. Derek stepped off without fanfare, just a single backpack and a slow breath. The ocean glimmered behind him, vast and indifferent as ever. He didn't look back, not because he was finished, but because he was already listening for the next story the water might tell. One day, he knew, it would speak again, and when it did, someone would need to be there to hear it. Months had passed since the container first surfaced from the depths, and the ocean seemed on the surface to have returned to its usual rhythm. The Atlantic Surveyor had long since left Derek behind, continuing its commercial assignments, while he had walked away from the contracts and routines that had defined his life for decades. The discovery of the sealed container, the records, and the evidence of long-hidden corruption had changed everything, though nothing about the world outside his own life reflected that at first glance. To the casual observer, he was just another diver who had done his job, nothing more, nothing less. But the currents of consequence had carried him into a different realm of awareness, one where the quiet truths he had unearthed would continue to echo far beyond the sea. Derek had taken up residence near the coast, in a small apartment overlooking a harbor that was alive with the movements of fishing boats, yachts, and cargo ships. The smell of salt in the air reminded him of the days spent immersed in brine and pressure, yet he now felt more like an observer than a participant. His life had slowed, but it was not static. The story of the container, Osmond, and the exposed corruption had become a touchstone for many, and while Derek had no desire for attention, he could not escape the occasional call from journalists, former investigators, or civil engineers seeking insight or confirmation. He answered cautiously, maintaining the balance between involvement and distance, aware that any misstep could compromise the very truths he had helped reveal. The exhibition at the Maritime Museum had drawn large crowds, and although Derek had chosen not to attend in person, he had followed the installation closely. The container itself had been transported to a secure wing, preserved under controlled humidity and lighting to maintain the condition of both the structure and its contents. Specialists had reconstructed the interior almost exactly, replicating every bolt, every seam, and even the positioning of the small household items that Osmond had maintained within the container. The notebooks, blueprints, and photographs had been carefully documented and displayed alongside the physical reconstruction, providing a tangible connection between the secrecy of the deep and the scrutiny of the public eye. Through the exhibits, families affected by the bridge collapse had found closure. Survivors and descendants moved quietly through the halls, pausing to trace the lines of Osmond's meticulous notes, to examine the photographs of structural failures and marked documents, and to see the reconstructed living quarters of a man who had fought to preserve the truth. Each visitor, in their own way, bore witness not only to a story of negligence and corruption, but also to the extraordinary resilience of one man who had chosen to survive and to safeguard evidence in a manner that defied the ocean itself. Derek had known, from the first moment he saw the container's gleaming edges on the seabed, that it was not merely metal and wood, but a repository of human perseverance and moral determination. Despite the public attention, Derek's life had grown quieter. He had taken up small consulting work with independent marine research teams, helping to train divers in careful documentation and recovery procedures, emphasizing the importance of chain of custody, proper handling of evidence, and the meticulous recording of environmental conditions. It was work that brought him satisfaction without drawing him back into the maelstrom of corporate oversight or legal scrutiny. It allowed him to remain connected to the sea without compromising the lessons he had learned from the ordeal of the container. Yet he never quite shook the feeling that his life had been irrevocably altered, that some part of him remained tied to the vast, unknowable depths from which the evidence had emerged. Even in the quiet, however, there were reminders of the past. He had saved copies of photographs and notes, encrypted and stored in waterproof containers in a secure location, a diver's instinct to ensure that nothing could be lost again. Occasionally, late at night, he would review the images, Osmond's precise diagrams, the meticulous household interior, the bolted furniture, and feel the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. The ocean had given up its secret once, but he knew it was patient. It could wait, and when it chose, it would reveal again. The container had been a singular, extraordinary occurrence, but the principle it embodied, the careful, deliberate preservation of truth, was a practice that could be applied wherever secrecy sought to dominate over transparency. The community around the Maritime Museum had embraced the story, and Derek found solace in the knowledge that the public now had access to the materials he had first recovered. Students, engineers, historians, and ordinary visitors could see firsthand the consequences of corruption and the painstaking effort required to safeguard evidence in extreme conditions. Derek had provided testimony for technical clarifications, ensuring that the narrative conveyed the accuracy of his observations without embellishment. Through these contributions, he had become an invisible bridge between the abyssal silence of the ocean and the moral reckoning of the surface world. There were nights when Derek would walk along the shore near his apartment, letting the wind whip salt spray against his face, the rhythm of the waves matching the pulse in his chest. He thought often of Osmond, imagining the man within the container, carefully maintaining the space he had constructed, recording details with precision, knowing that discovery was a chance, but not a guarantee. He considered the courage it had taken to live within such constraints, the quiet determination to ensure that the truth would not die, even if the world above had forgotten or ignored it. The realization settled in him that the ocean does not forgive negligence or malice, but neither does it reward it immediately. Its reckoning is slow, deliberate, and impartial. Months turned into a year, and the container's presence in the museum became a point of reflection not just for visitors, but for Derek himself. He watched as engineers traced the worn lines of Osmond's handwriting, as students marveled at the ingenuity required to maintain a habitable space at the bottom of the sea, and as families stood in silent contemplation before the reconstructed furniture and bolted items. In each of these moments, the work Derek had done, the choices he had made, and the risks he had taken were validated in ways that transcended personal acknowledgement. The truth he had helped uncover was no longer confined to memory or personal logbooks. It had become a tangible legacy, a testament to diligence and courage. Yet, he also knew that such clarity rarely comes without cost. Derek remained a careful observer of his surroundings, aware that the forces which had once sought to suppress the container's secrets still existed, moving through offices, boardrooms, and corridors of power. He had learned to navigate those waters with the same meticulous attention he applied underwater, recognizing patterns, noting anomalies, and documenting everything with precision. The lessons from the depths had not been forgotten. They were internalized, forming a moral compass that guided him in both professional and personal spheres. On certain mornings, when the tide was exceptionally calm and the sunlight fractured across the surface like shards of glass, Derek would take a small dinghy out onto the water. He would drift for hours, the engine cut, letting the waves carry him slowly over the spots where the container had once rested. There, in the quiet, he could almost feel the pressure of the deep and the silence of decades, as though the ocean itself acknowledged the change that had occurred. He reflected on how easily the truth could have remained entombed, how fragile the human connection to evidence can be, and how crucial vigilance is when facing structures, physical, legal, or moral, that seek to conceal wrongdoing. Despite the tranquility of these moments, Derek's awareness of potential threats was ever present. He monitored maritime traffic, checked public records, and stayed in discreet contact with journalists and independent investigators, ensuring that any attempt to manipulate or obscure the evidence would be met with immediate documentation. This ongoing vigilance was not paranoia, but a professional necessity born from the experience of encountering the container, witnessing the precision of its preservation, and observing the lengths to which certain individuals or organizations would go to bury the truth. As time went on, Derek began teaching workshops and seminars for aspiring divers, engineers, and maritime researchers. These sessions emphasized the meticulous procedures required to maintain chain of custody, document findings accurately, and understand the ethical responsibilities of those who uncover evidence. He included the story of the container as a case study, not as a sensational tale, but as a lesson in diligence, integrity, and moral courage. His audience listened with rapt attention, aware that the lessons drawn from a single dive in Florida waters were applicable far beyond the maritime context. Throughout all of this, Derek maintained a quiet personal routine. He walked the beaches, recorded observations in his journals, and occasionally ventured into the deeper harbor to inspect old wrecks or ship components, not for discovery, but for the satisfaction of knowing he could still navigate the waters with precision. The container had altered the course of his life, but it had also reinforced his connection to the sea, the patience, the observation, the discipline required to work within an environment that could destroy or conceal in equal measure. On the anniversary of the container's recovery, Derek found himself standing on the museum steps, watching visitors arrive, families enter, students cluster in groups, and the sunlight glint off the glass cases housing the artifacts. He did not join them. He did not speak. Instead, he observed, silent and reflective, feeling the continuity of human action and consequence. The container, once hidden in the pressure and silence of the ocean, had become a conduit for understanding, a symbol of accountability and a reminder that the choices of one person could ripple outward, affecting countless others. The ocean continued its eternal motion beyond the harbor, waves rolling in and breaking against the shore, indifferent to time, human affairs, or memory. Yet, in the museum, the echoes of the deep remained, preserved in steel, wood, paper, and glass. The story of survival, perseverance, and moral responsibility had surfaced, permanent and undeniable. Derek turned from the steps, feeling the wind on his face, and walked toward the water. He paused on the sand, looking out over the horizon, the sun casting long golden reflections across the waves. He breathed in the salt air, aware that the sea held many more secrets, some waiting, some forgotten, some deliberately hidden. For now, the truth had come to light. And Derek, though he had left the ship and the corporate world behind, carried it with him, knowing that vigilance, patience, and conscience were as vital as any dive line, decompression schedule, or technical measurement. He let the water lap at his feet, calm and unrelenting, and felt the quiet satisfaction of one chapter concluded. The storm had passed, the container had surfaced, and the consequences of the past had been reconciled with the present. The ocean, eternal and impartial, continued to move, and Derek walked forward, ready to meet whatever depths awaited next, prepared, watchful, and resolute. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you never miss our next incredible discovery. Hit the like button if this shocked you, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We want to know. Don't forget to share this video with friends who love mysteries and unbelievable real-life finds. Stay tuned, because the next story could be even bigger and you won't want to miss it.